You saw the sirens and you saw the frantic reporting about an oxygen mask and a stretcher, but you probably missed the real story happening beneath the chaos. The headlines are screaming about a heart attack and a collapse in the holding cell, but what we are actually witnessing is the physical manifestation of a political system pushed completely beyond its breaking point. When the shouting stopped and the silence took over, it was not just one man gasping for air. It was a stark revelation of how fragile the illusion of invincibility really is when the protective layers of wealth and privilege are stripped away. You are watching a constitutional crisis play out as a medical emergency. And while the media focuses on the heart monitor, we need to focus on the structural failure that brought us here. This is not just about the health of a former president. It is about the health of a republic that has turned governance into a gladiator sport, where the stress of accountability is finally exacting a physical toll. Let us be clear about what officially happened so we can understand the economic and social gravity of this moment, moments after what witnesses described as an explosive and vitriolic screaming match with Senator Ted Cruz on the Senate floor. Donald Trump collapsed in the holding area. The reports indicate he was clutching his chest and struggling to breathe before losing consciousness entirely. Paramedics rushed him out on a stretcher with an oxygen mask strapped to his face, and he was transported to the nearest federal medical facility where he is reportedly in critical condition. The doctors are suspecting a massive cardiac event triggered by the extreme stress of the trial and his recent imprisonment. The man who has spent a lifetime projecting an image of unassailable strength and endless energy is now fighting for his life in an intensive care unit. The fighting has stopped and the shouting is over, but the uncertainty has just begun. You might be wondering why an economist is talking to you about a medical emergency and a Senate argument. The answer lies in the deep connection between political stability and your everyday economic reality. We often treat politics as a reality show that happens on a screen far away from our jobs and our bank accounts. But events like this shatter that separation. When a central figure of the political landscape, arguably the most polarizing figure of the last decade, collapses, it sends a shockwave through the institutions that govern your life. The markets react to uncertainty, and corporations pause their investments, and the machinery of government grinds to a halt to watch the drama unfold. This is not just a personal tragedy for a family, it is a systemic rupture. The argument with Ted Cruz was not merely a personal spat, it was a symptom of a fractured ruling class that has lost the ability to govern through consensus and has resorted to open warfare. Think about what it means when the mechanisms of justice and the pressures of political survival become so intense that they physically break the people involved. We have built a political economy that rewards conflict and spectacle over policy and stability. The incentive structures in our current system encourage the kind of high-stakes confrontation we saw on the Senate floor. Politicians are rewarded with attention and fundraising dollars when they attack each other rather than when they solve problems for workers and tenants and small business owners. But today, we saw the human cost of that incentive structure. The stress that triggered this collapse is the same stress that permeates the entire system. It is the stress of a society that is constantly at war with itself, where every issue is an existential battle and where compromise is seen as weakness. I want you to consider how this affects you directly. When the leadership class is consumed by this level of chaos, they are not doing the work of managing the economy or fixing the healthcare system or ensuring that you have a fair shot at a decent life. Their eyes are glued to the hospital updates just like yours are, but they are the ones who are supposed to be steering the ship. The paralysis that follows an event like this means that critical decisions get delayed. It means that the volatility in the stock market could impact your retirement savings or your job security. It creates a vacuum of power that is often filled by fear and speculation. You deserve a system that is boring and predictable and focused on your well-being. But instead, you are getting a front row seat to a medical drama that has hijacked the entire national conversation. We need to analyze the buildup to this collapse because it did not happen in a vacuum. This was not a random medical event. It was the culmination of months of intensifying pressure. The trial and the imprisonment and the relentless public battles have created a pressure cooker environment. In economic terms, we talk about stress testing a system to see how much load it can take before it fails. We are watching a human stress test in real time. The altercation with Cruz was the spark, but the fuel was the accumulated weight of legal accountability colliding with political ambition. For decades, we have seen public figures use their power to insulate themselves from consequences, but the structure of this trial stripped away those protections. It placed a former president in a position of vulnerability that he likely never expected to face. That cognitive dissonance, the gap between his self-image as an untouchable titan and the reality of being a prisoner subject to the rules of the court, creates a psychological and physiological strain that is almost impossible to quantify. This situation reveals a profound truth about the relationship between power and the human body. We often ascribe superhuman qualities to our leaders, and we expect them to be tireless and invincible. But they are biological entities just like you and me. They are subject to the same laws of nature and the same limits of endurance. When we build a political and economic system that requires its participants to operate in a constant state of hyper-conflict, we are setting them up for this kind of failure. And when they fall, they take the stability of the nation down with them. The silence that has fallen over the Senate and the media is the silence of a system that does not know how to process its own fragility. Everyone is waiting to see what happens next because our institutions are not designed to handle the incapacitation of such a central figure in the middle of such a volatile legal process. You need to look past the sensationalism of the ambulance footage and ask yourself what this means for the rule of law. If the process of accountability is so grueling that it leads to physical collapse, does that undermine the pursuit of justice, or does it underscore the severity of the charges? There is a narrative forming already that the system pushed him too hard, that the stress was inflicted as a form of punishment. This is a dangerous narrative because it shifts the focus from the alleged crimes to the process of adjudication. It turns the defendant into a victim of the state, regardless of his guilt or innocence. As an economist, I look at this and I see a struggle over the legitimacy of our institutions. If a large portion of the population believes that the legal system physically destroyed a political leader, that erodes trust in the very framework of our society, and without trust in institutions, markets fail and contracts become meaningless, and the predictable order that allows you to go to work and pay your bills begins to unravel. The fight with Ted Cruz is particularly symbolic here. These are men who have been allies and rivals, and who represent different factions of the same political movement. Their clash on the Senate floor was a microcosm of the internal war within the conservative movement, a war over the future of the party and the country. That this political struggle escalated to the point of a medical emergency shows that the stakes have become dangerously high. Politics is supposed to be the alternative to physical conflict. But here the lines blurred. The verbal violence became physical trauma. This matters to you because when the people in charge are fighting for their political lives, they are not fighting for yours. They are not thinking about the rising cost of housing or the stagnation of wages or the crumbling infrastructure in your community. They are locked in a death match for control, and the collateral damage is the governance of the nation. We are going to walk through the mechanics of how this situation developed and look at the specific pressures that led to this moment. We will examine the role of the media ecosystem that feeds on this conflict and the legal structures that created this high-pressure environment. It is easy to get lost in the immediate drama of the intensive care unit updates, but my job is to help you see the machinery behind the curtain. We need to understand how the intersection of media spectacle and legal procedure and political polarization created a perfect storm that no human body could withstand indefinitely. This is a story about limits, the limits of a man and the limits of a system and the limits of a public that has been exhausted by years of constant crisis. You are tired of the noise and the chaos. And now the source of that chaos has been silenced by a medical emergency, but the noise of the machine keeps grinding on. We need to talk about the silence that follows the noise because that is where the real mechanics of power are revealed. The ambulance has left the Capitol, and the cameras are now trained on the hospital entrance. But the machinery that chewed him up and spit him out is still running in the background. you have to understand that what happened to Donald Trump is not just a biological failure. It is a failure of the brand he spent a lifetime cultivating. The brand was invincibility. The brand was the idea that he could outlast any investigation and outshout any opponent and outmaneuver any legal system. But biology does not care about brands, and stress does not care about polling numbers. When you strip away the rallies and the adoring crowds and you place a man in a cold courtroom or a stark holding cell, you are removing the fuel that kept that engine running. The collision between the myth of the Superman and the reality of the human body was inevitable. And today that collision happened on national television. Let us look closely at the catalyst here, which was the confrontation with Ted Cruz. This was not just two politicians arguing over a vote. This was a clash between the past and the future of a movement that has lost its way. Cruz represents the wing of the party that wants to inherit the base without the baggage of the man who built it. Trump represents the refusal to let go. Witnesses say the argument started over loyalty and escalated into personal insults, but the subtext is purely transactional. It is about who owns the donors and who owns the voters, and who gets to direct the flow of capital and influence for the next election cycle. They were fighting over the assets of a political corporation that is effectively in bankruptcy. And in that moment, the stress of losing control, the one thing Trump has feared more than anything else, likely spiked his blood pressure to dangerous levels. The heart attack, if that is indeed what it is, serves as a brutal metaphor for a movement that is attacking its own organs. I want you to think about what this means for the stability of the country. We are in a situation where the former head of state is incapacitated and the political faction he leads is in disarray. In a healthy democracy, there would be clear procedures and a sense of calm continuity. But we do not live in a healthy democracy. We live in a fragile one where institutions hang by a thread. The markets are already reacting to the uncertainty because capital hates a vacuum. If the leader of the opposition is removed from the board, even temporarily, it throws every calculation into chaos. Corporations that were betting on a certain regulatory environment now have to hedge their bets. Lobbyists who were banking on specific favors now have to find new patrons. The ripple effects of this collapse will be felt in boardrooms and trading floors across the world, but the cost will be passed down to you. The volatility will show up in higher prices and delayed hiring and a general sense of unease that makes everyone hold on to their money a little tighter. The irony here is palpable. The man who mocked the stamina of his opponents and questioned the health of his rivals is now the one in the hospital bed. But we should not take pleasure in this irony. We should see it as a warning. It is a warning that the politics of personal destruction eventually consumes the destroyer. We have created a political culture that demands total war 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We demand that our leaders be performers, constantly on stage, constantly fighting, constantly entertaining us. No human being is designed to live like that. The cortisol levels, the lack of sleep, the constant adrenaline, it burns you out. And when the leader burns out, the movement often burns down with him. You are watching the physical limits of populism. It requires a singular charismatic figure to sustain the energy. But when that figure falls, there is no structure left to hold it up. Consider the environment of the holding cell where he collapsed. It is the great equalizer. It is the one place where his wealth could not buy him comfort and his lawyers could not buy him time. For a man who has lived his entire life in gold-plated towers, the stark reality of the penal system, even in its most accommodated form, must have been a shock to the system that we cannot fully comprehend. This is the mechanics of the collapse I mentioned earlier. It is the friction between expectation and reality. He expected to be treated as a king in exile, but the legal system treated him as a defendant in custody. That friction creates heat, and eventually something has to catch fire. The shouting match with Cruz was just the venting of that heat. The collapse was the structural failure. You might be asking why this matters to your daily life beyond the spectacle. It matters because while the country is fixated on the intensive care unit, we are not talking about the fact that your rent is too high. We are not talking about the fact that your wages have not kept up with inflation. We are not talking about the looming crisis in commercial real estate or the student debt bubble. All the oxygen in the room is being sucked up by one man's heart. This is the tragedy of our current moment. The legitimate grievances of the working class, the struggle to pay bills and find affordable health care and retire with dignity are all pushed to the margins. We are hostages to the drama of the elite. We are forced to watch them fight and scream and collapse while our own lives quietly get harder. The distraction is the point. Even when it is not intentional, the system is set up to prioritize the health of the powerful over the health of the public. I want to address the reports about the severity of his condition. Critical condition is a terrifying phrase, not just for the patient, but for the nation. It implies that we are on the precipice of a massive historical shift. If he does not recover or if he is permanently sidelined, the power vacuum will be instantaneous and violent. Not physical violence necessarily, though that is always a risk, but political violence. The fight we saw with Cruz will look like a playground squabble compared to the war of succession that will break out. Every ambitious politician who has been waiting in the wings will rush to claim the mantle. The donor class will scramble to pick a new horse. And in all that chaos, the actual business of governing will be completely abandoned. You will be left to fend for yourself while the titans of Washington fight over the scraps of the movement. This is why we need to understand the systemic nature of this event. It is not just about a clogged artery. It is about a clogged system that cannot circulate power peacefully or predictably. We also need to look at the responsibility of the enablers who brought us to this point. The people who surrounded him, who cheered him on, who encouraged the very behavior that led to this stress test. They are now the ones giving somber interviews to the press. They pushed him to the edge because it was profitable for them. They rode the tiger as long as they could. And now that the tiger has collapsed, they are wondering how to get off without being eaten. There is a deep cynicism in the way his allies are reacting tonight. They are already calculating the political capital they can gain from his martyrdom or his recovery. If he survives, he is a hero who cheated death. If he does not, he is a legend who was hounded to his grave. Either way, the political machine will try to monetize the outcome. You need to be smart enough to see through that. You need to see that they are using a human tragedy to sell you a political narrative. There is a human element here that we cannot ignore despite the politics. A family is gathering at a hospital. Children are worried about their father. In our anger at the damage he has done to the country, it is easy to forget that. But forgetting it makes us part of the problem. If we dehumanize him, we become just like the system that dehumanized us. We can hold him accountable for his actions and his policies and the chaos he unleashed without losing our own humanity in the process. The goal of a just society is not to revel in the suffering of its enemies, but to build a system where such suffering is not necessary to achieve justice. We wanted him to face a jury of his peers, not a cardiac arrest. We wanted a verdict based on evidence, not a verdict based on biology. This outcome cheats us of the closure we need as a country. It leaves everything unresolved, hanging in the suspended animation of a hospital waiting room. As we move forward into the next few hours and days, the narrative is going to shift wildly. You will hear conspiracy theories about poison and foul play. You will hear medical experts speculating without access to the patient. You will hear pundits blaming the deep state for stressing him to death. My job is to help you cut through that noise and keep your eyes on the economic and structural reality. The reality is that a man who is synonymous with American excess has finally paid the price for it. The reality is that a political party that built itself on anger is now watching that anger turn inward. And the reality is that you are still waking up tomorrow to go to a job that probably does not pay you enough in an economy that feels rigged against you, regardless of who is in the White House or the hospital. That is the story we cannot lose sight of. The heart of the former president may be failing, but the heart of the economy has been failing the working class for decades, and no emergency team is rushing to save it. We have to follow the money to truly understand why this confrontation became lethal. Because in American politics, the flow of capital and the flow of adrenaline are inextricably linked. The screaming match on the Senate floor was not just a release of anger. It was a desperate bid for market share in an attention economy that is rapidly shrinking. You have to realize that for the last decade, Donald Trump has been the single most valuable asset in the media and political landscape. His outbursts drove ratings, his tweets moved markets, and his rallies sold merchandise. The entire ecosystem of cable news and social media platforms and fundraising committees was built around the generator of chaos that he embodied. But every asset eventually depreciates. And what we saw today was the violent correction of an overvalued stock. Ted Cruz was effectively trying to initiate a hostile takeover of the brand while the chief executive officer was being indicted. The stress that triggered the collapse was the friction of a monopoly falling apart in real time. This is where the mechanics of the situation become deeply cynical. The very people who are now offering prayers and calling for unity are the same ones who engineered the pressure cooker that put him in the intensive care unit. The Republican leadership spent years feeding the beast because it won them elections and tax cuts for their donors. They tolerated the erratic behavior and they rationalized the legal transgressions because the return on investment was high. But when the legal bills started mounting and the poll numbers started slipping, the calculation changed. They did not push him out with a vote or a policy debate. They pushed him into a corner where the only way out was to fight until his body gave out. They outsourced their responsibility to the legal system and to biology. They let the stress of the indictments do the work that they were too cowardly to do politically. It is a form of passive-aggressive leadership that is pervasive in corporate America and apparently now in the Senate. I want you to think about the disparity in how the system treats stress and illness depending on your tax bracket. If you are a shift worker or a teacher or a nurse and the stress of your job causes you to have a heart attack, you are likely worried about how you will pay for the ambulance ride. You are worried if your insurance will cover the rehabilitation. You are worried if your employer will hold your position while you recover. That fear, that gnawing anxiety that keeps you up at night is a feature of our economic system, not a bug. It is designed to keep you compliant and working. But when a former president collapses, he gets the best care in the world on the taxpayer's dime, and the entire machinery of the state stops to accommodate his condition. There is no question of coverage. There is no question of job security because his job is simply being himself. The safety net that catches him is woven from gold, while yours is full of holes. The prosecutors who brought these cases were doing their jobs enforcing the law, but the strategy of the defense was to delay and obfuscate and attack. That strategy requires an immense amount of energy to sustain. It requires the defendant to be in a constant state of combat mode, by refusing to accept any accountability, by fighting every subpoena and every motion. Trump forced himself to live in a state of perpetual high-stakes conflict. He built a prison of his own making long before he ever stepped foot in a holding cell. The lawyers who encouraged this never surrender approach, who billed millions of dollars to keep the fight going, they were feeding the stress that ultimately failed their client. They were paid to keep the temperature at a boil. In today's digital world, cryptocurrency is no longer just a trend. For many people, it has become a real business opportunity that can be started with basic knowledge and an internet connection. The first step in treating crypto as a business is education. Understanding simple concepts like Bitcoin, Ethereum, wallets, exchanges, and how the market works is essential before putting in any money. Some people use trading to earn short-term profits, while others focus on long-term holding. And there are also options like staking and passive income where crypto can grow over time without constant buying and selling. What makes crypto attractive is flexibility. You can work from anywhere, control your own schedule, and start with a small amount if you are careful. However, crypto is not gambling. Successful people treat it seriously. They do proper research, manage risk wisely, and never invest money they cannot afford to lose. The market goes up and down, so patience and discipline matter more than chasing quick profits. When crypto is handled with planning and consistency, it can become a long-term income path instead of a risky shortcut. If you want more simple and practical videos about crypto and online income, make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay connected for upcoming content.